New places, new perspectives, same questions, better answers. I'm Rowan Vale, and this is where learning becomes identity. The focus of today's episode is going to be on knowledge, truth, and morality across borders. Over the last few podcasts, we've looked at external forces shaping college students' identity formation, from race and gender to sexuality and ethnicity, access and belonging. But today, I want to shift our focus from who am I and think more about how do I know who I am. We've asked what happens when students cross borders and encounter new cultures, new communities, and new ways of seeing themselves. But eventually, another question emerges. Not who am I, but how do I know? How do I decide what is true? How do I evaluate competing perspectives? How do I make sense of a world where reasonable people can disagree? And how do I decide what is right? Language learners encounter these questions constantly. A student begins studying another language expecting to memorize vocabulary and grammar. Instead, they discover something far more complicated. People interpret experiences differently. Cultures define values differently. Even simple questions often have multiple answers. What begins as language learning becomes an exercise in perspective taking, critical thinking, and moral reasoning. Today, we're going to think about what happens when students discover that knowledge, truth, and morality are more complicated than they once believed. Let's explore. Let's begin today by thinking about how students reframe their thought processes from right answers to multiple perspectives. Most of us grow up believing that knowledge works a certain way. Someone asks a question, and an expert provides an answer. And if we study hard enough, eventually we'll know the answer too. School often reinforces this idea. There are right answers, wrong answers, correct responses, incorrect responses. For many students, language learning begins this way as well. You memorize vocabulary, you learn grammar rules, you study sentence patterns. And naturally, you expect that every question has a correct answer. But eventually, something strange happens. A student asks, "What's the correct way to say this?" And the answer becomes, "Well, it depends." It depends on the context. It depends on the relationship. It depends on the situation. It depends on who's speaking. And suddenly, certainty begins to disappear. William Perry described this process through what he called intellectual and ethical development. Perry observed that many students begin college seeing the world through what he called dualism. In dualistic thinking, knowledge is viewed in absolutes. There are right and wrong, good or bad, true or false. Authorities are expected to possess the answers, and learning is largely about acquiring those answers. But college has a habit of complicating things. Language learning has a habit of complicating things too. Students begin encountering perspectives that conflict with one another. Experts disagree, cultures disagree, communities disagree. And eventually, students enter what Perry calls multiplicity, recognizing that multiple viewpoints can exist simultaneously. Later, many move toward relativism, where knowledge becomes contextual and evidence matters more than certainty. For language learners, this shift happens constantly because every new language reveals something important. The world is way more complicated than we first imagined. This leads us into thinking, how do we learn to evaluate evidence? Often, realizing that multiple perspectives exist creates a new problem. If everyone has a perspective, how do we decide what to believe? This question sits at the center of King and Kitchener's reflective judgment model. Their theory focuses on how people reason when faced with questions that don't have simple answers, questions where uncertainty is unavoidable. Think about some of the questions language learners and globally minded students encounter. Should endangered languages be preserved? How should societies respond to immigration? What responsibilities do wealthy nations have toward poorer nations? What does equality mean across different cultural contexts? These aren't math problems. There isn't an answer key, and that's exactly the point. In the early stages of development, students often assume there must be a correct answer somewhere. Maybe they just haven't found the right expert yet. King and Kitchener called this pre reflective thinking. Later, students begin recognizing uncertainty. They realize experts disagree. Evidence can be interpreted differently. Different cultures may arrive at different conclusions. And this is called quasi reflective thinking. Eventually, some students reach reflective thinking, where they understand that knowledge is constructed through evidence, context, and ongoing evaluation. The goal is no longer certainty. The goal becomes thoughtful judgment. And perhaps that's one of the greatest gifts of language learning. Not that it teaches students what to think, but it teaches them how to think through complexity. In a modern collegial context, finding your own voice is at the center of a college experience. And of course, learning how to evaluate ideas is only part of the story. Students must also learn how to trust their own voices. This is where women's ways of knowing becomes especially interesting. Mary Belenky and her colleagues studied how women developed their understanding of knowledge, authority, and voice. Their work described several different ways of knowing, including silence, received knowledge, subjective knowledge, procedural knowledge, and constructed knowledge. When I think about language learning, I see pieces of this journey everywhere. At first, many students simply want to learn rules. Tell me the answer. Tell me what to memorize. Tell me what the teacher wants. And that's understandable. After all, learning something new can feel intimidating. But over time, students begin trusting their own experiences. They start making connections, drawing conclusions, testing ideas. Eventually, they learn that knowledge is not simply received, it is constructed. And perhaps nowhere is that more obvious than in language learning. Because there comes a moment when students stop translating every sentence in their heads. They stop asking permission for every thought and they begin speaking imperfectly, uncomfortably, authentically. Their voice emerges, not because they've mastered the language, but because they have learned to trust themselves within it. I think it's now important to recognize that thinking is not the same as knowing. After we begin trusting ourselves, we begin noticing something important. Learning how to think doesn't automatically tell us how to live. A student can understand complexity, they can evaluate evidence, they can appreciate multiple perspectives, and still face difficult decisions. Questions about fairness, responsibility, justice, relationships, obligation. Understanding knowledge and making moral decisions are related, but they are not the same thing. Which brings us to another kind of development: moral development. This road toward moral development leads us to the last leg of our conversation today, which is the road from knowledge to ethics. Imagine you're studying abroad. You witness something that feels unfamiliar, maybe even uncomfortable. How do you decide what is right? Lawrence Kohlberg devoted much of his career to answering questions like this. His theory of moral development suggests that individuals move through increasingly sophisticated ways of reasoning about ethical issues. At earlier stages, decisions may be guided by punishment, reward, or authority. Later, individuals focus on social expectations and maintaining systems. Eventually, some begin evaluating situations through broader principles, such as justice, equality, and human rights. But Kohlberg wasn't the only scholar interested in morality. Carol Gilligan argued that morality is not always centered on rules and justice. Sometimes morality is about care, relationships, connections, responsibility, empathy. And when I think about language learning, I see both perspectives at work. Language learners constantly navigate questions of fairness, but they also navigate questions of care. How do I communicate respectfully? How do I listen carefully? How do I build relationships across differences? How do I respond when someone else's experiences challenge my assumptions? The goal is not simply to become knowledgeable, the goal is to become thoughtful, ethical, reflective, and aware of our responsibilities to others. Because every conversation is ultimately about more than words. I think it's about people. Next time, we're going to look at spiritual development. Today, we explored how language learning changes the ways students think. We've seen how students move from certainty towards complexity, how they learn to evaluate evidence, and how they develop their own voice, and how questions of knowledge eventually become questions of ethics and responsibility. But even after students learn to navigate complexity, another question often remains: what gives life meaning? What values guide us? How do we make sense of purpose, faith, belief, and belonging in a world filled with different perspectives? For many students, global experiences don't just challenge what they know, they challenge what they believe. And next time, we'll explore spiritual development and examine how language learning, intercultural experiences, and encounters across differences can shape students' search for meaning. I'm Rowan Vale. Until next time, stay curious about who you're becoming.